Many of you will know that I never speak in public longer than let me just turn that down a bit, longer than I can make love in private, so in conclusion, the only reason I've explained to Madison, I've never actually been the star speaker at an ASI event before. I've been on panels at the ASI function, but I've never done the whole thing. And I've only turned up today because I know that the best audiences are intelligent, well-educated, and slightly drunk. Our subject today is F.A. Hayek. How many people know about Hayek? How many people don't know about Hayek? Right, excellent. Okay, we've got one. Right, so let me start at the beginning. He was born in 1899 in Vienna. And he turned out to be one of the most influential economists on the planet. He equaled, in the 1930s, he equaled Keynes in terms of his international acclaim. There was a great debate between him and Keynes on how the economy should be run, and Keynes, of course, felt that the government had a huge role in terms of leading demand and stimulating the economy, and Hayek felt exactly the opposite. He was also involved in political events or public policy, political science. He was a political scientist as well as an economist. And in 1944 he published a book called The Road to Serfdom, where he was, since he was Austrian originally, he left Austria in the 1930s, came to talk at to lecture at the London School of Economics, to escape Nazi persecution. And he was so sort of angry at the war going on, there was nothing he could do, so he wrote this book, a war book, which is called The Road to Serfdom. And it shows how, with the best will in the world, if you start on the road to social democracy and you think, oh, well, yes, we can have a fairer society and all of that kind of stuff, what he indicates was this is exactly what happened in Germany, and that eventually it ends in totalitarianism. And I mention this because I see the portrait of Winston Churchill here. Winston Churchill, of course, read this book, and just before the 1945 election, and said the way things are going, we're going to have the Gestapo in Britain. So this caused a great hoo-ha, huge hullabaloo. And again, Hayek, was put onto the front pages. And Hayek actually wrote about his, I think, probably only encounter with Churchill. And he said, I was at a dinner, and Churchill was there, and somebody ushered him over and said, oh, you must meet Professor Hayek, the author of The Road to Serfdom. And Hayek thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to get some views of Winston Churchill on my book. And Hayek wrote, unfortunately, he said, Winston Churchill, the man was stock drunk. And then he said, half an hour later, he stood up and gave the most brilliant speech I've ever heard. so that's Hayek. I think Madison and I first met Hayek in 1976 at the Montpellier Society in St Andrews. In fact, some years later, we ran a campaign to get Hayek elected as Chancellor of St Andrews, the titular head of the university. And he wasn't elected. An Austrian guy got no connection with Scotland. You wouldn't expect him to be elected. So, but we did very creditably, and we raised the debate and got Hayek into people's minds. And some years later, I think probably about 86 or 7, and I just done my first book on Hayek, and he came to our office in London, and we had some prints of St Andrews on the wall. And he said, he had this thick Austrian accent, which he never lost. It's one of the reasons why Keynes sort of trumped him in the 40s debates, because Hayek was an outsider, he wasn't part of the establishment, He didn't speak very good English. He had this thick Austrian accent right through to the end of his life. And he said, St. Andrews, how interesting. I was once run as Chancellor of St. Andrews. And I said, yes, Professor Hayek, and I was one of those who was managing the campaign. But of course you weren't elected. No. And I said, you weren't elected because everybody said that you were too old. And he said, well, he must have been in his 80s by then. And then I said, right, you'd be interested to know that the other three candidates are all now dead. I thought I was actually going to kill him. He was choking so much as he laughed. But he went through a very poor state of health in the late 60s, early 70s. And everybody thought he was sort of on the way out. And then in '74 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. And from then on, he was like a spring chicken. He just, he was zipping around the world and giving talks and getting honorary degrees and goodness knows what. I remember that we had a meeting of sort of Austrian economists, what we called the Karlmenger Society in London in 1978, I think it was. And Hayek came along and he said, I tried old age and decided I didn't like it. But I just wanted to sort of mention a few things which Hayek said and wrote about, which I think are extremely relevant for today. One, there are 8 of them. And for any of you who have a mathematical bent, which I have to say Hayek was not, he believes that mathematics has very much of a place in economics, and neither do I. Firstly, that society can usually run itself pretty well without interference from politicians. Hayek showed us that because something is natural, it isn't planned, it doesn't mean to say that it's not structured. You look at a society of bees and so on, and they seem to work out and they're doing things, and they clean hives and they go out foraging and it all works hunky-dory. But nobody imagines that there's a kind of head bee that gets together in a sort of bee parliament and gives the orders, and there's bee officials who make sure it's done. It just spontaneously happens. Or the flight, he says, of geese migrating. They go in a V formation. Isn't the goose in front is giving orders and saying, well, you get there a bit and you get there and so on. And that chap behind that chap, it's not like that at all. It's a kind of natural thing. They obey a sort of a rule. You look at you want to be away from the chap in front. So it works out. Or the rules of grammar, he says, as well, where we don't even understand what the rules of grammar are. If you or I tried to write down the rules of grammar, we'd get stuck pretty quickly, but somehow we all seem to know it, and from that we have a structured language. So there are rules of actions that tell us how we should behave in social situations. And the market economy is just one such order. It doesn't have to be planned from the center. It can work itself out just absolutely wonderfully. Secondly, I think Hayek would say, let's actually be proud of capitalism. Just in the last 20 years, capitalism has taken 2 billion of the world's population out of abject poverty, let's face it. Hayek would say that Marx was wrong. Capitalism is not contradictory, it's not sowing the seeds of its own destruction, it's not going to end up in monopoly, size is not the same as market concentration. Yes, you need big firms, but we have competition, we have new firms coming along all the time, it's a process. And I always say, I look in old magazines from the 1950s and you look at the adverts and none of those firms exist anymore. Because things change and evolve. And the market is able, says Hayek, to deal with huge amounts of information which planners could never get round to. Everybody has an idea of their own circumstances, they know what their customers want, they understand their customers, shopkeeper, they get regular customers in every day, they know what they like and what they don't like. that's the sort of thing which it's actually impossible. That's the sort of information which is in your mind. It's actually impossible to express it. Like the rules of grammar, it's impossible to send it up to some central planning agency in Whitehall and for them to crunch the numbers and send it back again and tell you what you ought to be doing. But by the time you've done that, the customer's out of the shop. Hayek says it's like estate agents. That estate agents have to know, not just from year to year, but from day to day and hour to hour, what the local market conditions are. If they had to send all that information up to Whitehall, firstly they'd send only the least scum of it. They wouldn't send what is really important, which is their understanding. And then secondly, by the time it had been crunched in Whitehall and come back again as do this, do that, it would be totally out of date. So Hayek's view was that central planning was a mistake. We are all planners. We all plan our own lives and our economic situation. But it's better to have lots of people deciding their own lives rather than to have one central planner who's deciding it for everybody, because then all of your eggs are in one basket. And when I think of things like, just to tie it into the contemporary debate, when I look at things like Vince Cable suggesting that we should have a state investment bank and that somehow the government can know what industries are going to succeed in the future and where Britain's promise lies, I think probably people who are investing their own money and who are involved in business 24 hours of every day, 7 days a week, and looking at where to invest for the future, they probably actually know more about it than Vince Cable. It's only a guess. But if we go the Vince Cable route, we've made one enormous guess, huge volumes of taxpayer money. If it's not right, we've lost an awful lot. If lots of little people make different guesses, well, some will be right, some will be wrong, but we can quickly correct, and then we can invest in the things that really will work. And that's how you grow and evolve. And Hayek, certainly in The Road to Serfdom, says that the larger the government is, the less able the politicians are to control things. So they have to give the implementation of policy to bureaucrats. They're not elected. They have arbitrary power over the rest of us. And then you get a completely unaccountable bureaucracy. And when I think about the chief whip swearing at the police in Downing Street, I think there's many cases in which I would have liked to swear at the police for being so absolutely stupid, because they've got rules and that's the way they work. But you've got a bureaucracy which is just detached from the real world. And of course, in The Road to Serfdom, this great book in 1940s, Hayek also said, in order to make this enormous great system work, it doesn't actually work. So in order to convince people that it's working and that government intervention can actually solve all these problems and all the rest of it, you've really got to sort of control the media and the propaganda. And well, when I look at the relationship between politicians and the media, it's a very incestuous relationship. The media depend on politicians for the stories. Under the Brown administration and Blair administration, it was absolutely terrible that public information would be leaked to newspapers in order to get a good spin. And then similarly, the politicians rely on the journalists to puff them up. That's another step down the road to serfdom. The third thing I would say that's important to from Hayek today is that the government shouldn't be in the business of fixing the rewards of work. A lot of people think, well, the market's very unfair. There are a lot of people who have enormous merit, but they don't do very well out of the market. Professors, most of them, actually write this stuff. And therefore, we really ought to have a society in which people of merit are rewarded and people of not merit, don't get so much. Hayek rejects this entirely. He says, okay, who decides who has merit? You have opera singers who've just happened by talent or breeding or whatever it is, for good fortune to have fabulous voices, or wonderful entertainers. They're just good at what they do. Are you going to say, well, that's a lucky accident and you shouldn't be paid for doing that? We should mark you down because that was just luck. You didn't put any effort into it. He says the whole thing is completely nonsense. And again, the bigger the government becomes, the more rewards there are in divvying up the spoils. So if we have the idea that government should decide how much people are paid, how wealth should be distributed, the bigger the government is, the more possible benefit you can get from rigging it in your favour. So the more incentive there is to form an interest group, to go and campaign in Parliament and to make life difficult for the politicians so that they give in and give you the money. And what you then have, of course, is a society which is at each other's throats rather than a collaborative, cooperative society which is the free market. The fourth thing I would mention is that Hayek was very much of the view that freedom is absolutely essential in making the free society and the free economy work. That coercion, he thought, was an evil. Forcing people to do things that they wouldn't naturally do was an evil, and that, as it was an evil, it should be minimized. We need as little coercion as possible. And again, when I look at government regulation of our lifestyles, whether we should or should not be able to take drugs of our choice, whether we can drink as much or as little as we wish, whether we can smoke in clubs like this, even I suppose, you might say, well, whether we can go fox hunting or whatever. But all of these things are coercing us to live in ways that we wouldn't normally wish to live, and curbing our freedom. And according to Hayek, that actually risks the entire social order. The social order is this natural, evolved thing, it's like the beehive and so on. It all seems to work. When you start intervening in it, then you don't know what the results of your intervention are going to be. You're sending signals across the entire system and network, and you just don't know what that's going to be. And the unintended consequences of your actions can be very destructive indeed. Whereas a free civilization is very constructive, it's very creative. Lots of different people coming up with lots of different ideas, doing their own thing, living the way they like. These things are create a thriving society where we can look at different ideas, we can choose the best ones, improve those even further, ditch the ones that don't work. That's the best way to do, rather than having your own, all of your life invested in some big guess which is made by the government centrally that may or may not pay off. We don't know. And says Hayek, the rules of this freedom must be general. It's things like free speech. You cannot say that just because people might abuse free speech, they might, I don't know, who knows, they might heckle politicians at a party conference or do anything like that. The fact that some people will abuse it and will say, well, I've got free speech, so I'm going to write this article which is completely untrue about some person or whatever. Okay, that happens. But, says Hayek, the general benefit of having these general rules where we've got general freedoms, people say what they like, that completely outweighs the idea of that you should intervene and you should say, well, of course we have free speech in this country, but don't you dare attack this group or that group or whatever, because that's not allowed. If you're going to go for it, and then you will find actually that this is creative. I take the sort of Friedman line on this, which Friedman said. Friedman was Jewish, of course, and he said a lot of people go around and they're critical of Jews and they don't like Jews and all the rest of it. He says, well, I will try and convince them that they're wrong, but I certainly respect their right to say these things, and it's better that they should be able to criticize my race rather than that I should try to have an active Congress to say, no, you can't say all these nasty things. So that's the benefit of freedom. Hayek says that, fifthly, you do need some coercive power, yes, right? We need to make sure that our laws are enforced, but that itself must be limited, that you must have a constitutional arrangement whereby the politicians themselves have to respect the rule of law, that they themselves are bound by the same laws. That laws must be, they must firstly, he says, allow a private sphere, that there should be some things, a lot of things, in fact, which the law simply doesn't legislate on. And again, I think of, right, well, if I want to set up a cigar club and smoke cigars with my chums, why shouldn't I be able to do so if we're all agreed that and we're quite prepared to suffer lung cancer or lip cancer or whatever it is, why shouldn't we be able to do that? Secondly, he says the laws should apply equally, and I look at things like progressive taxes, where we decide, okay, well, people with big houses are going to pay more tax, people who earn more than £100,000 a year are going to pay 50%. That is not an equal treatment under the law, and I would oppose those things. Thirdly, taxes, he said, or the laws, he said, should be known and they should be certain. And I don't think our laws are known or certain at the moment. If you just look at the tax code, right, Tolley's tax code for accountants is 11,520 pages long. I don't think any of us know what the tax law is in this country. I don't think we could know that. And he says taxes should not be retrospective. Again, look at Barclays. The Inland Revenue decided that Barclays was being aggressive in terms of tax avoidance. Tax avoidance means that you work through the rules, that you follow the rules, but you just make sure that you're following the rules that mean you don't pay as much tax. But they stung Barclays with a bill for 500 million, purely retrospectively. This was stuff that they had done in the past, and the tax authorities said, well, if you don't pay this bill, then we're going to make life even worse for you. Now that is retrospective legislation, and Hayek will point out that that is a step down the road to serfdom. On the other hand, the market, says Hayek, is the most powerful cooperative tool that the world has ever known. And that, just take a woolen jacket, go back to Adam Smith and think of the thousands of people involved in producing a simple garment. The shepherds who raised the sheep and cut the wool, and the dyers and spinners and the fullers, and the people who make the tools, and the shippers who ship the dyes over the planet, and all the rest of it, the suppliers and the shopkeepers and all the rest of it. There are thousands of people involved in the simplest product. And the great thing about the market is we don't have to agree on what society should look like. We just buy and sell and trade. Indeed, the more we disagree, the better. If you and I disagree on the value of something, then we'll swap it. And we will both consider ourselves made better off by the trade. So the market is a hugely powerful mechanism. It works through what Hayek calls the miracle of the price system. That prices indicate where there are shortages of supply and excesses of demand. And when you start to interfere in the market and you start to try to control prices, which governments are always trying to do these days, you mess up that delicate mechanism, and you don't know where that's going to go. One of the things which Hayek is really rising in reputation for now is his views on the boom-bust cycle. This, of course, is extremely relevant. Hayek naturally lived through the Great Depression, and so he looked at that, and indeed, with another Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, he started in Austria in the 30s and the 20s an institute to explore boom-bust cycles, business cycles, credit cycles, and to try and work out what was going on. And Hayek, I think, is probably the only person who's come out with any credit of all of the things that have happened since 2007, because his explanation is a good deal better than most other people's. And his view is that it is the boom-bust cycle. The bust always follows the boom, it's inevitable. But the boom is caused by central bankers. And in our case, it's the Bank of England, which has kept interest rates too low for far too long. And that is, if you like, that's one of these price signals. If borrowing is cheap, then people borrow more. And the trouble, though, is that you get all this borrowing. People borrow, they invest in their businesses, they expand their businesses, they buy houses, they buy bigger houses, the credit is cheap, everything's working, fantastic, boom, wonderful. But then, of course, because you've got lower interest rates, people don't save so much because they're not getting so much return on their money, and eventually the banks run out of cash. Then, of course, what happens is you've got a lot of businesses who've invested in a lot of stuff. They've built factories, they've invested in equipment, they've developed new product lines, and there's no demand for it because the money is simply dried up. And so Hayek would say that banks are not the cause of our present situation, and government certainly isn't the cure. And that the only solution really is to go through the adjustment process. It's just like, you've been high on alcohol and the next morning you're going to get a headache. You've got to go through that, because what's happened is people have invested in the wrong things, they've invested in luxury products, resources are in the wrong place. It's going to take some years, but those resources have got to be reallocated to uses which are more useful. So in terms of the shape of a liberal society, Hayek would say that a liberal government is a small government. Where's the applause and the acclamation for this? And that the trouble with increasing power, expanding government, is that it means there are more spoils for interest groups to lobby for. And that governments can't really create things. It's like making a crystal, he says. All you can do is to create the conditions in the jar that the crystal will grow out of. You can't sort of take the atoms and put them and make them into a crystal yourself. You've just got to create the conditions under which a prosperous economy and a prosperous society will emerge. And he has an interesting point, just as the last point, I think, on one of the current debates where we're talking about reform of the House of Lords and whether it should be made much more like the House of Commons and should be elected. And Hayek says, well, fine, I'm all in favour of elections, but having separation of powers is not enough to save you from the road to serfdom. That what you need to do is to have, there's no point in separating, if you like, power which is itself unlimited. And the House of Commons power is unlimited, and if you're just going to make the House of Lords, another version of the same, that's also unlimited. And so what he suggests is that you should have a sort of House of Commons type of chamber where they decide the administrative procedures, how the government's run and so on. And then the other house, basically what it does is to decide whether these laws apply equally to everybody. If they don't apply equally to everybody, if they discriminate against particular groups, if it's politicians trying to help their own home district or their own trade union or business supporters, whatever, that should be struck down. So he has two houses of Parliament or Congress or whatever, but they have very different functions. So I will leave it to you to decide how far down the road to serfdom. We are. But one of the points that Hayek makes is that you find yourself slipping down the road to serfdom remarkably quickly. And then, as he discovered, of course, from his own country in the 1930s, by the time you are into slavery, it is unfortunately too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We have roughly 20 minutes for questions and discussion. I wish to say just one thing personally about Hayek. He was mild-mannered, he was most excellent company. He was charming, courteous, always polite. I am not. I am not chairman tonight, and therefore questions will be brief. They can be questions or contributions. Anything over a minute, and I will start to get impatient. Anything over 2 minutes, and you are forced to buy a copy of Eamonn's book at £10. Yes, you, sir.
The excellence. Thank you very much for that.
Can you say who you are? So
David Wright. Right. The excellent Stephanie Flanders programme, which I looked at last night, referred to a period in British history where there was very little government intervention. In other words, the Victorian era. And there we have a situation where children are down the mines and so forth, totally unregulated. What's your view about that level of intervention?
Yeah, one at a time, first.
Sorry, am I in favour of the Victorian period?
Do your own children go down mines?
Where there are no laws or very little intervention by government, it can lead to exploitation, especially of miners. I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, we're talking my view or Hayek's view. I think Hayek's view would be that generally we are better to do without the regulation. I mean that Hayek was very much of a humanitarian. He was a deeply humane person, and he did think that the state had a duty to get involved in certain things, including welfare, including the relief of poverty, relief of disasters that happen and things like that. He actually changed a little through his life, and towards the end, in his later years, I think he was, if you like, more libertarian than he was at the beginning. At the beginning, some people have said, well, he's got a list of things which he thinks the government might get involved in, and actually that opens the door to almost anything. But towards the end of his life, I think he became increasingly skeptical about intervening, because he felt that, firstly, government did it for its own purposes rather than for the good of the general public. So it wasn't as if we were intervening because this is the right way to run a society. We were intervening because my party supporters think that we should do this or do that. So I think I got increasingly sceptical about the ability of governments to run the economy and to run society in any kind of perfect way, and that probably we would be better without it, and that what you would find is that civil society would do these things for you. It would produce a welfare system, it would produce charitable giving, and all the rest.
Okay, Tim Evans, can you say who you are first?
Tim Evans, Senior Fellow at the Adam Smith Institute and Chief Executive at the Cobden Centre. Some of the most important work by Hayek was actually written, of course, in the 1920s and the early 30s. And I think in the context of this crisis, his ideas, as they evolved, on the denationalisation of money has to be mentioned, and surely it has to be central. Eamon, my question to you is, what would Hayek's advice be today? We now live on a planet where all kinds of the advanced democracies are getting to ever more debt. You mentioned central bankers keeping interest rates low and creating this credit boom. What would Hayek recommend?
Yes, the denationalisation of money is an interesting idea, which is that at the moment money is a government monopoly. the government prints it. If you try to print your own, you're going to find yourself in a slam. So the government has a monopoly of money. You could, I suppose, use euros or dollars or whatever you like, but there's a legal tender rule that that only sterling is legitimate for the settlement of debts. So the government has a monopoly of money, and it's just like government having a monopoly of anything else, right? Or anybody having a monopoly over anything else. They're going to be lazy and boring, and they're going to put the price up and all the rest of it. So basically what happens is that when you've got a monopoly of money, you can be pretty sure that that money is going to be abused for the benefit of the people who are printing it. And of course, we're printing very large quantities of it at the moment. So Hayek came up with this idea of denationalizing money, basically having competition in currency like you have competition in anything else. So that if Tim here wanted to produce, the Tim Evans dollar, and it was demonstrably better than the pound sterling because it kept its value, we'd all start using that. Or we could use dollars, or we could use yen, or whatever we like. I think that Hayek was drawn to that really out of exasperation. I think that was the sort of last resort, really, that he hoped that governments could manage our money better, but I don't think that he had very much faith that they would. And therefore, the only solution would be to make them face the forces of competition, just like the rest of us have to face the forces of competition in the rest of our lives.
Okay. Will you take questions in twos?
Yeah, I'll take the questions.
Let's do questions in twos. Okay, one there and then one here. There.
Couple of prime ministers. One of the reasons Churchill lost the 1945 election is attributed to his fact that he suggested the Gestapo were going to turn up in Grantham. Did his reading the Road to Serfdom actually pave the way for aptly winning the election and introducing the welfare state? And when Margaret Thatcher took over in 1979, inflation was running at 10% and there was 3 million unemployed. She famously carried around a copy of Hayek in her handbag user, assaulted people with. When she left office in 1989, inflation was running at 10% and unemployment was at 3 million. Did she actually understand Hayek, or was that just
on a technical point? When Mrs. Thatcher took office, inflation was in the 20s.
No, it was in the mid-60s.
26.
No, that was only in 1974, I think.
No,
through it, mate.
No, we're talking about the inflation that Labour government built into the Serfdom. Anyway, sorry, could you say who you are?
Mohammed Amin, I can guess what Hayek's views of the National Health Service might have been, but did he actually give any kind of written critique of it?
Okay, two questions.
Well, I can answer the second one, which I think is no. I'm pretty sure in that. I don't think that he commented on that. In terms of actually, and was reading the Road to Serfdom a really bad thing? No, I don't think so. I think that. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not a historian. I don't know the details of the 1945 election, but I think probably the 1945 to 51 was an interesting period because it demonstrated to an awful lot of people that nationalisation was a complete disaster, and it didn't work. There were strikes everywhere and all the rest of it. In terms of Mrs. Thatcher, yes, well, absolutely right. She was introduced to Hayek just after she'd become leader of the Conservative Party, which I guess was about 75.
Yeah.
And there was a famous incident where she was in the Conservative Central Office in Smith Square, and there was a group of people from the policy unit, and they were saying, "Oh well, Mrs. Thatcher, we really think that we should have, we should be pursuing the third way." You know, the third way was a sort of third way between radical capitalism and radical socialism, which I guess third say. And so they were all making these points and so on. Whereupon Mrs. Thatcher reached into a briefcase as usual.
Handbag.
Well, handbag. They say handbag. Actually, it was a briefcase. Actually, pulled out a copy of Constitution of Liberty by Hayek, slapped it on the table, and said, "This is what we believe." that was good.
Does anyone know what's that in the movie? Two more questions. Yes, one here and one there. Yeah. So Stuart, yes?
Stuart Weeder, Treasurer of UKIP. The Chancellor is being urged to stimulate the economy, but you said that Hayek felt that the government should not do that. Was his reason that it didn't work, or was it some other reason?
Yeah, Hayek once famously
Could you
said
say
that,
who you are?
Yeah, my name is Nicholas Vardy, Global Guru Capital. Hayek once famously said that he is a nothing but an old-fashioned Whig. And he also wrote a very famous essay called Why I'm Not a Conservative. Could you comment on Hayek's relationship to both the Whigs and the Conservatives?
Right.
In context.
Okay. On the stimulus question, no. What Hayek says is this, that you have had a long period of a credit boom, that interest rates have been too low, borrowing has been too easy, and therefore people have borrowed like mad, they've invested in things that aren't going to work, they've built factories, they've bought equipment, they've produced new production lines, they've bought bigger houses, and then they've remortgaged and bought even bigger houses, and then suddenly it all, you just can't sustain that. It's like a drug. You just, eventually it takes bigger and bigger doses to give you the same high, and eventually you can't have a bigger dose. You just collapse. And so Hayek says that's the position that you're in. And if you are then going to take government money and then try and build more things, create infrastructure or whatever, you're doing exactly the wrong thing. What you've got to do is you've got to realize that you've got factories in the wrong place, producing the wrong stuff, you've got equipment in the wrong, you've got people in the wrong place, producing the wrong stuff that people no longer want because they're all broke. What you've got to do is simply let that work its way out. That you've got, it's hard, it's tough medicine, and politicians like to go in and say, well, my solution is this and so on. But Hayek's solution is, well, do nothing, just let the economy work itself out so that the resources eventually go back to where they are needed, not to where we thought they were needed because we were all high on cheap credit.
Yeah.
On Whigs, right, I'm going to defer to Madsen, who's Madsen actually wrote an article on why F.A. Hayek is a conservative. And he knows a lot more about it than I do.
No, I leave it to you, Eamonn.
You can do it later.
Sorry, so no one's going to answer the question?
All right. Well, let me give you Madsen's answer to the question, which you can read in my book, by the way, because I do mention it. Yes, you've got to carry it out occasionally. And basically, Hayek thought that he was not a conservative because he thought conservatives, resisted change and were, liked old-fashioned ways of doing things and so on. I think, if I can say it without getting it wrong and distorting it, I think that Madsen's rebuttal is that actually no, conservatives are not against change, but they believe that change should occur slowly and incrementally.
Organically.
Yes, that it's an evolutionary process. And this is how Hayek saw society, actually, as an evolutionary process. He didn't see it as big revolutions. Indeed, he criticized big revolutions because, when you try and rip up the whole thing, then you're going to create something that's just going to be a mess, and we saw that in the French Revolution and all the rest of it. But you make progress by just doing a little bit better here, a little bit better there, and you grow, and you understand what works, and you don't do what doesn't work, and so on. And that really is, if you like, a conservative way of doing things. I was going to say conservative way forward. It's a conservative way of doing things that you grow incrementally. So I think the argument is that Hayek, although he didn't realise it, probably is actually conservative, or was a conservative.
Right, one at the back and then one there. So, can you say who you are?
Emily Scarba. So I just like to thank you for the talk and ask you curiously, because I haven't had an opportunity to read this book that has just now come out, But I want to ask you about the title of the book, because it seems, I'm curious as to why it is that you say the ideas and influence of the libertarian economist, because to me, the subtitle seems to suggest that Hayek had his political and ideological views presupposed before he began his economic analysis. So why is it not just the ideas and influence of an economist that happen to lead to particular?
Okay, got it.
And the second question, please.
David Phipps. On the basis that individualism is important, and bearing in mind that under the present system of democracy, there is no separation of power between legislative and executive, what could be better than ripping apart democratized dictatorship?
Oh, attempt not more than one question.
Right. Well, let me tell you the first. Right, okay. People who write articles and who write books never write the headlines, and they never write the titles. I didn't write the title. But I'm perfectly happy to justify the title. Hayek, of course, became a libertarian in his later years. Actually, he says that he started life as a sort of Fabian socialist, and that it was meeting the other great Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, who knocked that out of him, really. And he says that he applied for a job because Ludwig von Mises was head of an office which was designed to sort out some of the economic problems, the debt problems that had followed the treaty at the end of the First World War, where countries were broken up, and so they had to decide, well, what do you do about the debt and all the rest of it. And so Hayek came to him with a recommendation from one of his professors that this was a gifted economist and Mises should employ him. And Mises, of course, was a teacher at the university as well. And Hayek turned up with this letter saying this is a gifted economist at the University of Vienna. And Mises said, well, I have never seen you at any of my lectures. But after that, they got on rather famously. So he started off as a socialist, and then, of course, he went to these seminars that Mises organised, and then he realised, no, he wasn't actually a socialist. And Mises wrote this huge volume in 1920 on socialism, and Hayek read it, and that sort of turned him. So from there on, I think through his life, he got more and more libertarian. Yeah. In terms of the separation of powers, yes, well, perhaps we do need a bit of a revolution. I mean, Hayek was looking at a sort of ideal constitution and saying, well, there should be separation of powers, but they should be different powers, and so that the one limited the other, so that the one house, which was in charge of sort of running the government function, would be thwarted by another, which said, well, if you try to legislate in such a way, that will discriminate against certain groups of people, and that's not allowed. If you're going to have a law, it's got to apply to everybody. So I suppose that is a kind of revolutionary concept, but there you go.
Okay. Yeah, one over there. Back, yes. And then one over here.
No, not me. Sorry, I thought it was me.
Yeah, you.
Dominic Morris, Adam Smith International, I'm working this evening. I was struck by what felt like your rather narrow interpretation of the causes of this crisis, i.e. the Bank of England. And I mean, given that the state was removed and the markets were liberalised more than in recent memory, it just felt that you perhaps you underplayed the role of crony capitalism and the fact that people at the top of the market are being paid. There's a market failure at the top of the market, and they are being rewarded in ways that they're getting an annual salary that's life-changing, and so they don't actually play by the same rules as we follow their market and demand, and we all make terrible decisions based, dependent on theirs.
Yeah. Okay.
It's John Hunter. Hayek's emphasis about freedom, I'm wondering what would be his attitude to workers freely combining into a trade union as long as they freely want to do this. There's emphasis on freedom that workers can combine.
Yes, you're right. There are lots of causes of the crisis. You've got the American regulation on the banks and so on, trying to force them to lend money to poorer people. Very noble intent of trying to get everybody on the housing ladder in the United States. But, of course, that led to the subprime market. I think what Hayek would say is this, right? Now, I want the entire front row to stand up, right? Yeah, right, on you go, right? Very good. There's 8 of you. That's roughly the number of retail banks that we've got in the United Kingdom. Right. Now, I'm going to make this room much, much richer. I'm going to pump in some quantitative easing, and I'm going to pump in £200 billion worth of quantitative easing. So that's basically you're going to get about £20 billion each, right? Because I'm the Bank of England, I only deal with banks, I don't deal with you guys. So, Keith, you guys at the back, how do you feel about that? Is that okay? Thank you. No, and this is what's happened here, that Hayek says that inflation, that money, goes into an economy like honey pouring onto a table. It doesn't go equally throughout the whole economy. The Bank of England can create money, but it doesn't go equally throughout the whole economy. It goes in at a certain point. In the 70s, the point it was going into was the big nationalised industries. They were booming, and everybody else was suffering. And when Mrs. Thatcher squashed down on inflation in the late 70s and early 80s, it was the nationalised industries just collapsed, because it's like a honey going onto the table, forms a mound, and gradually it works out through the rest of the economy. And that's exactly what we've seen recently, that we've seen money going into the economy, but it's going into the banks. And so these guys are still paying themselves fabulous amounts of money, because that's where the cash is going. And of course it's buying government bonds, so the government is carrying on spending like there's no tomorrow. So I think, Hayek's view has been criticised, and Friedman and other people have criticised it, and says, yes, it's more than credit. Credit doesn't explain it all. And I think they're probably right, but according to Hayek, credit is the main problem. If you've got interest rates that are too low, that's a price signal that infects the entire economy. It affects absolutely everything, and therefore it shouldn't be a great surprise if absolutely everything goes wrong. In terms of the unions, yes, of course, people are perfectly free to combine if they want to. Hayek in the 70s, saw the union threat in the UK and thought it was a very great evil. But he wouldn't stop people combining. What he was worried about is trade unions using their coercive power over politicians, saying, well, we've got 1 million people, we can not vote for you, or we can strike things down at party conferences and so on, using that power in order to try to manipulate public policy in their favour. And that, he thought, was, just like Adam Smith, he thought was a conspiracy against the public.